All right, cool. Let's get to the standards. So there are basically there's A standards, B standards, and C standards. Okay. And this is the information that we use as the basis of our work. So type A standards are basic, they're high level, and they're design guides. So for risk assessment, the two that you'll want to write down is ANSI P11.0 and ISO 12100. Okay, ANSI is the North American standard for risk assessment, and ISO is the international standard for risk assessment. Okay, they're starting to come to like more of a consensus with the national and international, so they're aligning those more and more. So there's are elements that overlap, but there you go. And then if for Canadian friends, any mouse? Oh, okay, just checking. C1002 is the Canadian risk assessment standard, or Z. Sorry, there's no names. Okay, so that's the A standards. Very basic, very broad overview, general stuff. Okay. I'll tell you the name of the website if you guys need it. I can find it. I'm not thinking about it right now. We use it. Eric, do you know what that website we use to get standards off of? It's called something Stream. TechStreet. Is it TechStreet? TechStreet. Yep. Yeah, TechStreet.com. That's where we get our standards. I think you pay a subscription. It's not astronomical, but then you have access to the PDFs. If any of you guys need any snippets from the standards, I have access to them and I can send you snips. I just can't like send it. Yeah, techstreet.com is where you could go to get your hands on all these standards and all NFPA, everything. Okay, and then there's type A, which is very basic overview risk assessment. Then there's type B. Okay, and when we get into type B, there's a B1 standard and there's a B2 standard. Okay, B1 standards are general safety aspects. They talk about how to apply safeguarding technologies generally. So that's where you're going to find things like how tall do my barrier guards need to be, right? Reach in distances, you know, things of that nature for installation of guarding. B11.19 is a B1 standard that I would write down. And ISO 13849-1 is another one that I would write down. That is principles of design. Same here. It's just the US version of the principles of design and also application of. Okay. And then Z432. Those are all B1 standards. And then within type B, there's also B2 standards. These are not, unless you guys are making your own safety equipment, which probably doesn't apply. These are standards that a company like an Omron, Key and Spanner, competitors would look at, right? Guys that make machine safety devices would adhere to these standards because they're specific to the devices. So they're telling us what we need to do to make our devices safety compliant. Okay, so there's one specifically for light curtains, there's one for interlocking devices, e-stops. Well, and I'll show you where that applies, but we follow those. And then there's type C. Okay, and type C is specific to the equipment that you are assessing, designing for, operating. So we should always, if we're working on a hydraulic press or we're working on a turret lathe or a surface grinder, figure out, is there a C standard that applies to that specific piece of machinery? And if there is, go there first. That'll have everything you need, and it's going to take precedence over these other documents. Okay, so that'll be a good place to start. If there is not a specific C standard for what you're making, which many of you are pretty creative and do some cool things with automation, so you might not find a standard, then you default to the more general, you go one up to the B1 standard. Okay, and then how do you know which standard you're dealing with? In the front pages of the standard itself, it's within the first 4 or 5 pages, there's a little summary. It'll say right in the front, it'll say this is a B1 standard, or B2. It'll tell you what it is. Any questions about that? All right.
Where do you go to search for if it has a C standard?
Great question. Where do we go? Google? Where do we go, guys?
We use ANSI.org.
ANSI.org.
Yeah, they can pay us.
Okay. ANSI.org. That's a good suggestion. I just Google. Come to us. If you got something specific, I've got experts I can go talk to. Yeah, I usually just Google it. C standard, turtle. Okay, no more questions. I think we're gonna do like oh, yes, sir.
So when they go in and do, like, when OSHA goes in and assesses or fines or whatever, something that was in compliance prior to them changing something or some industry standard changing, like, you almost need a full-time person to, like, lawyer to understand.
Yeah,
these things. I mean, that's.
yeah,
Issue, this whole.
totally. I totally get
So
it.
what do they find? Because it was in compliance when they brought the machine in, but then the standards have changed or whatever. But
Right.
They update them, whatever,
Yep.
5 to 7 years or whatever.
Yeah.
Now they're out of compliance, so they get fined for that because they didn't.
Okay, so the answer is yes, you could, right? And the standards, so they just came out with 2023, they came out with ANSI B11.19, the new version, just this year. The last version of that, I believe, was 2016, 2017, so it's 5 or 6 years. So the answer is yes. If the standard changes and there's something different and now your machine isn't to that, yeah, the answer is yes, you could be fined, right? The reality of it is, the standards change about 5 years, so it's not like they're changing every couple of years. I would have, so yeah, it's a thing to be, right? I will tell you, a lot of what they're changing is not with respect to existing technologies, right? Like they're not, in my experience, okay, they're not saying, oh, well, we used to say that the gates had to be this high, and now we're gonna make it this high. In my experience, more so what the new standards address is new technologies, right? Now we've got safety on networks, right? So we're relying on a network for machine safety, which is awesome because it's super fast. You get way more data, but then there's the network security issues. So now that's starting to shape things. So, I guess just sharing that it is a concern, and if it's an existing machine, there's not a huge probability that, right? Because that technology already existed when the standard, right, was. So just want to give you that sense. The other thing too is when OSHA sends somebody out to do an audit, it's not like the machine safety specialist guy, right? It's the OSHA guy who might be a specialist in machine safety. He might be a specialist in bloodborne pathogens. He might be a specialist in fall protection, right? They're just people that work for the organization. Some of them have domain expertise. Some of them are, they have a little bit of knowledge about a lot of things. And so the reason that I'm sharing that is that it can be the case that OSHA was in here. Like OSHA was in here, they didn't say anything, right? It's like, well, that's very possible. And it's also still possible that there's non-compliant things with respect to machine guarding because it was the generalist OSHA guy, okay? What happens is if an incident happens, now they're calling the machine safety expert. And the machine safety, or whatever the incident is, if it's fall protection, right? Machine safety, chemical spill, that expert's coming out on site and he's doing the investigation and he's gonna uncover everything, right? So that's how that kind of plays out. Hopefully that helped answer your question. So yes, in short, unfortunately, on the other side is mostly it's new technology. So,
Not really a question, but more of a comment, like, for example, like some kind of tweet on -2 for robotic systems. The -2 is applicable to what we do mainly, but the -1 is specific for the robot designers. So that standard is very clear. Some of the other standards aren't so clear. This is applied to me as I'm using a commercially purchased power harness, for example.
right,
Or if I'm designing,
right,
because we could do both. So that standard in particular is not clear. It applies to us. And sometimes there's information for both the user and the designer in the same standard. So we have a hard time, there's a lot of type C standards out there. We have a hard time figuring out which ones are applicable.
yeah. Yeah, we can help that be sort through. And the important thing is, when it comes to, so, and this is what I've learned in my time in safety, right? And there's a reason for this, but it's the case, is document why we do, what we base our work off of. And so that's an important thing to start with, right? Is to understand, okay, what document are we working on? And then we can go from there. So that's a number one place to start. The important thing is that once we do that, then we're documenting everything that was done and why we use the standard we used.